If you know a thing or two about fighting styles and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in general, then you should know that executing the perfect submission hold is an art form in itself. The ability to take your opponent to the ground, pinning them in a position where they have no choice but to tap out, is easier said than done. With all kinds of submissions from leg locks to arm bars, seen in the UFC, picking out the best submissions is no small task, but it has to be done. So, here are our top 10 UFC submissions of all time. Even if you forgot all about UFC 140, Jones's submission should be fresh on your mind. Coming into his second title defense, many fans thought the unique style of Machida would give young Jones all kinds of trouble. And it did. Machida came out guns blazing and controlling the fight on the feet. Jones even looked lost at times. But as all great champions do, Jones made the necessary adjustments between the rounds. And he began catching Machida with excellent shots. At the last minute, the hard left hand sent Machida to the ground. While he was coming up, Jones caught him in a standing guillotine choke submission. The Brazilian refused to tap, and he quickly passed out. The most badass MMA moment was seeing Jones letting go of the choke and unconscious Machida crashing to the canvas. Former UFC bantamweight champion Ronda Rousey was renowned for her judo-inspired armbar. During her MMA career, she used the hold to submit a total of 9 opponents. Rousey pulled off her most memorable armbar victory in 2015, in what would turn out to be the final submission win of her career. Incredibly, it came against arguably her most formidable opponent to that point. Kat Zingano was undefeated in MMA and had destroyed both Amanda Nunes and Miesha Tate leading into the fight. She was expected to test Rousey like nobody had done before. However, Alpha came into the fight too pumped up and made the error of charging at Rousey to attempt a flying knee. Rousey reversed the strike attempt into a throw and, with incredible skill, floated over Zingano's back to lock in a picture-perfect armbar. Seconds later, Alpha was forced to tap out. UFC 111 will be remembered for many things, and Poliares' superb leg lock was definitely one thing people will remember for a long time. Leg locks are relatively rare in the UFC, primarily due to the risks they represent inside the octagon. However, one fighter was more renowned for his array of leg locks than any other: Rousimar Poliares. Tokino came into the UFC in 2008 with a reputation for hurting his opponents with vicious leg locks, usually preferring the deadly heel hook. And in his 5th appearance in the octagon, he showed everyone why. Faced with Poland's Tomasz Dorwall, Poliares locked up a heel hook after just 45 seconds of the first round and wrenched it violently, causing Gorilla to tap out in agony. However, for reasons known only to him, Poliares continued to grab on the hold despite the tap out, doing untold damage to Dorwall's knee. It was an excessively violent submission even by the standards of the UFC. And while it was memorable, it also netted Tokino a suspension and a fine. Only the uninitiated will downplay Frank Mir's absolute dominance on the ground in his victory over Rodrigo Nogueira at UFC 140. Frank Mir had already broken the bones of 2 of his opponents in the UFC when he faced Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira at UFC 140. But given the Brazilian's renowned submission skills, it seemed unlikely he'd pull off the feat for the 3rd time. However, Mir stunned everyone by snapping Nogueira's arm like a twig late in the first round of their clash, providing fans with one of the most shocking submissions in UFC history in the process. Mir initially looked set to lose the fight as he was knocked down by a combination and then found himself caught in a guillotine choke. But the former UFC heavyweight champion somehow escaped and then engaged in a scramble that ended with him clamping onto a Kimura. Nogueira attempted to roll to alleviate the pressure on his arm, but only fell deeper into the hold. And before he could tap out, his arm snapped in a genuinely jaw-dropping visual. Where this Demian Maia went, no one can be sure. At this point in his career, Maia was a submission machine. He was taking out his opponents left and right, and his fight with Ed Herman showed how dangerous he was. He was able to roll Herman back onto the ground at one point just by having his legs entwined around one of Herman's, and even switched positions on him with ease, making fans think Maia might have been related to Gumby. While Maia has lost some of his most recent fights, mostly because he decided to stand and trade, it's worth remembering that he was one of the most dangerous ground fighters at one point. Hands down, Demetrius Johnson, the Mighty Mouse, is the most accomplished MMA fighter of all time, and his win over Ray Borg is his best performance. We dare to even go further and say it's a piece of art. The two met at UFC 216, and we don't have to say Johnson was a massive favorite. As expected, he dominated Borg for 4 rounds before executing one of the hardest BJJ moves ever in the 5th. He took Borg's back in the clinch against the cage and lifted him. But instead of scoring a powerful takedown, Johnson shifted to an armbar mid-air. As they both hit the ground, Borg literally landed into the armbar and was forced to tap. It was indeed a once-in-a-lifetime moment. When it comes to the submission game, very few fighters can match Charles Oliveira, with a stunning total of 14 submissions to his name. However, while DeBronx has submitted the likes of Jim Miller, Kevin Lee, and Will Brooks in his UFC career, the submission that stands out the most for him came over a largely unheralded foe in Eric Wisely. The fight took place in 2012 and saw Oliveira make history. He became the first fighter to win a UFC bout using a calf slicer. The ultra-rare move happened after Oliveira attempted a heel hook, only for Wisely to defend it excellently, almost twisting his way free. However, his leg was still caught by the Brazilian, and in an incredible move, Oliveira pulled his back into the calf slicer, causing him to erupt in pain before tapping out. Not only was this a visually stunning submission, but it was also one of the most unique in UFC history, putting it up with the greatest. Any video on submissions would not be complete without mentioning the epic bout between Anderson Silva and Chael Sonnen. What happened that night in Vegas will go down in history as maybe the greatest MMA comeback story ever. The trash talk and the entire build-up leading to the fight was insane. I mean, we're speaking about primetime Chael Sonnen holding the mic. Chael looked terrific the whole fight, and he dominated Silva for 4 rounds. His wrestling was on point that night, and we all thought we were about to see a new middleweight champ. But with just half a minute left, Silva managed to wrap the triangle choke, and Sonnen was in all kinds of trouble. People couldn't believe Silva was about to win with a Hail Mary submission. Sonnen did try to escape, but the Brazilian was squeezing the choke like a madman. In the end, Sonnen tapped out with maybe 20 seconds left on the clock. We've seen plenty of rare submission moves used in great effect in the UFC, from Charles Oliveira's calf slicer to a downright bizarre choke used by the unheralded Nick Pace in 2011. But none of them quite match up to the twister used by Chen Sung-jung against Leonard Garcia. Invented by the grappling virtuoso Eddie Bravo, the twister, a spinal lock that can leave a victim with a seriously damaged back, always looked like the sort of hold that simply wouldn't work in the UFC. But the Korean zombie proved that idea wrong in his fight with Garcia, as he took the back of Bad Boy in the 2nd round before transitioning into the twister hold. Immediately, it became clear that Garcia was in serious trouble, and despite the round having just 1 second remaining, he was forced to tap out before his spine was destroyed. This was perhaps the greatest submission to ever grace the octagon, simply because it made Gracie the first victor in the UFC tournament and cemented the greatness of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It was not the first submission, but it was the one that won the tournament and helped bring the Gracie name so much attention. It would be the founding moment of what would become MMA and the UFC today. It doesn't get any more legendary than that. We've come to the end of today's video. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more MMA content. Until next time.